Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. My name's Clark, and today I'm going to be making a video about Soft White Underbelly, a YouTube channel by Laita. This video was inspired by Brian, another YouTuber who goes by the name of the Necromancer. I'm going to link his videos. These critical analysis videos that he's put out recently struck a chord with me. He breaks down specific interpersonal issues, power dynamics, and unhealthy relationship patterns between Mark and some of his interviewees. I'll link his video. It's extensive and it's worth watching. I'm going to be responding as an associate clinical social worker. I'm not going to go into the same level of detail, but I'm going to discuss the broader ethical implications and boundaries as someone who's been watching Mark's videos for years and working with at-risk populations. I'm going to talk about the ethics, impact, and what this says about our culture. I'm also going to give some guidelines, guardrails, for other channels like Mark's, so that other channels that are still growing and making this type of content can seek to stay on the side of exposition and not on the side of exploitation. So I'm going to analyze Soft White Underbelly through the lens of informed consent, containment, and the power dynamics involved when vulnerable stories become content. First, I'm going to speak to the appeal of channels like Soft White Underbelly and why people are gravitating to them at the moment. I think in the past 5-10 years, there's been a lot of talk of the dead internet theory, meaning there's AI, bots, a lot of the internet isn't real anymore. And so I think that people are craving real human stories in an internet landscape that feels very inauthentic. It feels very similar to early Vice, as genuine subcultures and hidden worlds are being investigated and exposed. They're raw, they're unfiltered, and I think that is captivating. The channel gives voice to people often made invisible, whether that be poverty, addiction, sex work. A lot of times in the comments, I do see very supportive, compassionate comments from the public. And I think that for an interviewee, that can feel very liberating, and it can feel like they're being seen and heard. When this is done responsibly, the exposure can reduce stigma. However, it can also be damaging. As such, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethical concerns that come to mind. The first, most obvious thing to me is that many of the interviewees are highly vulnerable, whether that be that they're intoxicated, have serious mental illness, traumatic brain injury, or they're underage, meaning under 18. In these cases, informed consent gets blurry. I think the long-term consequences to permanent public exposure, being on Mark's YouTube channel, where many of the videos get 1 million views, 5-10 million views, the impact of that isn't always fully understood by the interviewees. That's what I mean when I say informed consent, and I'm going to give a definition of it here. The real-world impacts include family seeing it, probation officers, housing, and also personal safety when the individuals doing the interviews are name-dropping people in their community and might be talking about things that are illegal, for example. Pulling it back to my work at an outpatient, a lot of the older adults don't have a full understanding of what the internet is and the impact that it has. Compounding on this idea of at-risk, vulnerable individuals not having full grasp of informed consent, the incentive structure of Mark paying them to tell their story can come with some ethical issues. Andrew Callahan talks a bit about this on how exposure at this level can have unintended consequences when he talks about early in his career doing street interviews and having people reach out saying, my coworkers, my boss, people in my family saw something that I said when I was drunk one night, and he came up to them and threw a mic in their face, and they just said something out of pocket, and basically saying that he regrets doing that, and he understood the harm potential that it had. Next thing I'm going to talk about is the lack of dialogue and how the stories are framed. A lot of the interviews feel very one-directional rather than a dialogue. I sometimes hear folks say, "This is the first time I've ever said this to someone." I think that can be problematic when they've never told their story and there's no containment. I'm going to speak a little bit more on containment later. But if someone comes in and they've told their story and they've processed it and they've come to terms with what might be a traumatic event or just a harrowing life story, I'm all for it. And I think that exposure is good. But when someone comes on and has never spoken about something before, and Mark just listens and just has them keep telling their story, I think that the potential for someone to relive, re-experience the trauma with no containment is very high. Speaking more to this, there's limited reflective questioning, mirroring, questions that deepen understanding. Sometimes I'll see Mark even asking, prodding, probing questions about childhood trauma. I think in doing so, he's not exploring with care or context an individual story. He's more trying to go for the most shocking, sensational story that's going to get the most views on the channel. A lot of times, unboxing and unpacking trauma that someone's gone through should not be done when they are in an elevated state, a survival state. Their basic needs aren't being met. That can be more destabilizing. And what I often see is Mark pushing for a compelling narrative rather than relational depth. He's not really making a connection with the person. He's more trying to extract the most interesting or just a story that's going to get the most views. In addition to the views aspect of things, when you see the Soft White Underbelly videos posted, the titles and the framing defines folks by their diagnosis, their vices, or their pain. That labeling can be detrimental because it defines someone by their diagnosis or something that they struggle with. Language matters. And in the field of social work, what we're trying to do, or there's a push towards using language that does not define an individual by what they're suffering with. So as opposed to saying, "This is Mike, he's a schizophrenic," rather, you would say, "Mike's a person who struggles with schizophrenia," or "a person with schizophrenia," not a schizophrenic person, right? We don't want to reduce someone to a label. And I think a lot of times the thumbnails do so. That can collapse someone's identity into their suffering. So next I want to talk about trauma, containment, and clinical concern. I talked a little bit about containment earlier, but I'm going to give a definition here. So it means emotional safety, structure, and relational support when challenging subject matter, trauma, is shared. Trauma dumping is essentially, in some ways, the inverse of containment. It's chaotic, shocking, and uncontained. And it can create incentives, I think, in Soft White Underbelly videos to escalate distress in order to be interviewed again. Because those shocking, chaotic videos are the ones that people often click on the most and get the most views, I think there's a risk that people are either re-traumatizing themselves or putting themselves into more sketchy and chaotic situations in their life because they know that they're going to get interviewed again, the video is going to get a lot of views, and they're somehow going to get financial or exposure gains in some way. I guess I want to just bring up the fact that telling one's story in and of itself isn't inherently healing, especially if there's no containment if the person doesn't really feel heard. There has to be relational support. The person needs to be heard. And I don't see that being done oftentimes when Mark just asks 1 or 2 questions probing into someone's trauma, and there's no dialogue outside of that. So what are the constructive changes that I'd like to see? I'd like to see stronger ethical safeguards around consent. This largely falls on Mark. If the subject matter puts the person at risk, there might be a target on them in their community. I don't think those should be posted either. In addition, Mark's interview style needs to be more trauma-informed. He needs to ask more reflective, open-ended questions. I don't want to see as many leading questions pushing people into the darkest parts of their story. Post-interview, I think being grounded by a trained professional, this is ideal. Having a clinician, peer support specialist, or counselor, someone who can help ground people post-interview if they went into parts of their story that could have the potential to re-traumatize them. Some avenue for follow-up support. For example, reality dating TV shows. A lot of times there is follow-up by counselors or therapists helping people to work through all that comes along with their whole life or personality being exposed on such a wide scale to people on the internet and just to the public. In conclusion, Soft White Underbelly did give voice to people who are often unheard. There's real power in that and the potential to reduce stigma through exposition. But there's a fine line between visibility and spectacle. Thanks for watching. Comment down below your take on Soft White Underbelly and the rise in prominence of channels similar to it. And keep your eye out for the next video where I read from a Reddit/social work thread talking about Soft White Underbelly and give my take. So thanks for being here. Be well.